Hello, everyone. Now we're on to part two. Do I stay Christian? Yeah. So no, now, Brian, before you kind of guide us through part two, which is actually harder to write? Because I feel if I was outlining the chapters to part one, I thought I got some more chapters we could add. When it was part two, I said, well, no, see, he didn't add 15 chapters because then you'd have to have 15 yeses. And this is just in the construction of the book. I think the kind of which chapter titles are flowing which way,
Well, here's the problem. After you write part one and you take seriously these issues in our history that are continuing in our present, the last thing you feel is ethical is to try to minimize them. Can I tell you, I don't want to mention a name, but there was a very well-known evangelical who took me to task in public, I don't know, 15 years ago in some major publication. And I communicated with him in private, and he sent me an email where he said, the Crusades were exaggerated and the witch burnings weren't really that bad. In other words, his way to deal with these critiques was to minimize them and say, oh, they weren't that bad. And I just thought to myself, you're not making Christianity look more appealing by saying, these atrocities were not that bad. So the last thing I wanted to do is minimize the first 10 chapters. That was off limits for me. I think we have to take them seriously and make no excuses or minimization. So what that forced me to do in part two, yes, is to say, without minimizing them, what are there good reasons to stay Christian? And that's what, and I tried to live with that. And it wasn't like I had them figured out when I started. This was what the writing process was about. So I'd say the first 10 chapters were more painful to write. But the part two, yes, was in a sense the one that involved exploring some new territory I hadn't explored before.
Well, maybe you want to start by going through some of the answers and give those reading along and such an idea of where they're going.
Chapter 11 is because leaving hurts allies and helps their opponents. So this realization that staying or leaving doesn't just affect me, it affects other people. And so many incredibly wonderful people are doing good things to try to address the problems I talked about in the first 10 chapters. Chapter 12, because leaving defiantly and staying compliantly are not my only options. And so what I try to do in that chapter is complexify the options between you stay or you leave. Well, no, there are different ways to stay and different ways to leave. Chapter 13 asks the question, because where else would I go? And this realization that you can try to leave Christianity, but if you think you're going to join some other religious community where everything is fine, you'll have another realm of disappointment and disillusionment there. And 14, because it would be a shame to leave a religion in its infancy. And this putting things in a larger time frame, I think, is a way of realizing, the Christian religion in terms of world religions is somewhat of a youngster on the block. And we look at our Jewish neighbors and we can say in many ways their religion has had a long time more to mature, as has the Hindu religion and the Buddhist tradition as well. Chapter 15, because of our legendary founder. And ultimately, if I speaking very personally, it would be easy to leave Christianity, not easy to leave Jesus. I've never felt any desire or need to leave Jesus. But the problem is there a way for us to keep Jesus without letting the Christian religion define the terms under which we come to understand and interpret Jesus? Mm-hmm. So that's that's maybe the first movement of this second part of the book that in some ways, gets us to the point of, well, let's have some serious talk about Jesus in the middle of this, and freeing Jesus from the interpretations of the white Christian old boys network, for example, that we talked about in part one.
Yeah. No, I'm sure Diana loved her book plug when you support freeing Jesus there. What's funny is, and by the way, people, Brian and I didn't talk about what I thought about when I read his book until we did this. So like the thread that ran through the front of part 2, and obviously this is connected to my love for you and the kind of questions I think we both have. The thread that ran through is I regularly remind people like, well, what if we're still in the early church is a question. And if we are, then like I want when the story's told to be in the group that sounds as insistent, even though he had a minority voice like Paul, to the actual disciples of Jesus that were like, Paul, don't you read the Bible? Have you read it, Paul? I know you like it. And maybe you said it was God breathed, but like the snipping thing of the Gentiles, big deal. Where you eat, it's in there. Jesus said, don't even change a vowel lettering. And now you're running around, right? Just going through this whole thing. And one of the beautiful things about the Luke Acts is that the spirit of the risen Christ moves us into a space that even the historical Jesus didn't anticipate. And in seeing that and going at our present moment in the like big picture, I go, Jesus in his world was part of generating and passing on the invention of nonviolent resistance on behalf of the one good, loving God. And there's a whole book idea there. If we look at the story of humanity, how did we thrive? Social cooperation, social learning, coming up with stories and myths, and coming up not in a deflationary way. That human beings have grown in our network of commitments, and that's actually helped us thrive. And when you look at the big story of human history and our relationship to our non-human neighbors, what we need is to expand our boundaries of cooperation on behalf of love. Maybe from our tribe to our nation, to our neighbor and enemies, and maybe our non-human neighbors and ecosystems. Like, what if we're at the early church and then you say, who is it that has a picture of love and invites people to participate in that picture of love? In fact, has demonstrated what that love looks like when it faces down with the principalities and powers. It looks like cross. And yet the group says, no, that is not the final word. Then I'm going to say, well, there's a really good reason not to leave it to the uglies and think we're in the early church. Like if I just reread through, like why am I still a Christian? I was like, all 5 of these. Yes, yes, yes. And why? Because I want my grandkids to think that one of the avenues of being a good human, a good neighbor is taking seriously the emergence of nonviolent revolutionary love funded by an account of the ultimate.
Yes.
And where did it emerge? In Jesus. Where'd you see it expressed? Like in people like Gandhi and King. We have evolutionary reasons in our big picture to justify it as something we need to do. And if you like breathing and want your grandkids to do it, seems like a good reason not to walk out of a community and let the religious communities get continually dominated by what? White supremacy, Christian nationalism, allegiance to economism. Anyway, so that was those 5 chapters. That was through me. I was like, hell yeah, Brian, preach.
Oh, well, that's good. Well, I'm glad it worked that way for you, and that it sort of resonated, because I wrote this book not as a trick to try to strong arm people into staying Christian, but to help people think this through in a way that will work for them. Maybe I should mention the next 5 chapters and then see if we have any comments about those.
Yeah.
These next 5 chapters, in a sense, do something like this, Trip. In part 1, people say, I feel dirty being associated with this religion. In other words, I feel morally compromised to stay associated with a religion that's this dishonest about its past and this out of touch with some of the negative things it's doing in the present. But here's the problem. There are moral quandaries you face if you leave as well. And so in these next 5 chapters, chapter 16 is called Because Innocence is an Addiction and Solidarity is the Cure. And I talk about something that I call the cult of innocence. It's actually a term. I guess it's out there. I know that Nadia Bolz-Weber uses the term sometimes too. But this desperation for innocence has a lot of unintended consequences. And I want to explore that in that chapter. Then chapter 17, Because I'm Human. And this is the chapter where I try to reckon with the fact that the Christian religion, that its ugly features are actually features of every human organization I'm aware of. And even if I leave being Christian, I'm still a human being, and I still am stuck with those human characteristics. 18, Because Christianity is changing for the worse and for the better. And this realization that at this moment, in some ways, that white Christian old boys network has been in charge for so long. And there are pockets and places around the world where not straight white males are in control and are exercising leadership. To walk away just when they're having the first chance to have significant leadership sure doesn't sound very courteous, or it seems like giving up right when women and people of color and people from the LGBTQ plus community and so on are having a voice in the conversation. Chapter 19 is maybe one of my favorite chapters to write. It's where I got to say some things that I've been trying to say for a long time to free God. And the idea that whatever God is, we still have concepts of God that we don't allow God to be anything other than those concepts. And if part of what's going on right now is a need for us to let God be other than our pre-existing concepts, that sounds like a pretty good thing. And it's a terrible thing maybe to give up right when the idea of God is about to evolve for us. And then chapter 20, Because of Fermi's Paradox and the Great Filter, which is basically saying, look, we live at a moment of existential crisis. We face the existential threats of climate change, nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, an economic system that is crushing many while putting others in positions of unimaginable power and privilege. When we face that kind of existential threat, we need every resource at our disposal. And there are resources in the Christian faith that remain to be seized, like the image of a nonviolent, courageous leader whose nonviolence is not passivity. It is a more powerful kind of activism. So that's how this chapter, this section of the book kind of brings things together.
Yeah. And one of the things I loved about even the kinds of yeses you give is they aren't the kind of yeses those who don't hear no's give. Right? Like or just like the traditional ones in kind of modernity shaped Christianity, the yeses usually will have a chapter or two explaining the proofs for God's existence and go, well, you would say yes if you use rational thinking. And then you'd have like some way of explaining all the different doctrines. And it would lead up to going like, I've read your excuses. I've explained all your criticisms. So now, welcome
You're
back.
stuck. You're stuck. You have to stay Christian. You can't escape. You can't escape our clutches. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as someone who has actually written books, I don't know, like a new kind of Christianity, it's not like you don't have suggestions on how all these doctrines work, but the answers for staying Christian, in some sense, assume something about the reader, that they're only asking the question because they've encountered God through Christ. And there's something that animates and motivates, and they already find it compelling in some way. And are like, what am I doing here? Like, why do I stay here? And in part 2 goes to give the big deep exhale and look where we are, and then see what's possible for you to do on your own, and what can we do as a collective. And theologically, that would be called the body of Christ, right? Like, so was that deliberate, or is that just how your answers came out? Because I know my answers, but I teach philosophy of religion regularly. I would have to nod at all the ones I have very boring lectures about first.
Yeah, I wanted to trust my sort of deepest intuition in this, and I wanted to write the kind of book that I think I would not call BS on. And so I hope that works in these chapters. And all of us who have been in the Christian religion for a while have heard all of those arguments where people try to argue you into staying based on pre-existing assumptions of the Christian faith. It's the assumptions themselves that are the problem. So to argue based on those assumptions just makes me feel trapped. It doesn't make me feel like staying. It's unconvincing.
One of the images I always think of in about staying Christian, and so much of the way you focus the chapters clicks to it, is the conversations between Sam and Frodo in Lord of the Rings when they're in Mordor.
Oh, yeah.
And it's some of them. Obviously I read it quite regularly, and might be mentioning this in hopes to talk someone into having a post each episode of the new Lord of the Rings show podcast. But every time I get to those, I notice new things, and the context of it. They never think they're going to see their home again. That it's this failed mission, and all this kinds of things. And there are a few little things that give the threads that reanimate as they're going to, at this point, kind of a hopeless, deadless end. You get the scene where they discuss if anyone will ever tell the story and sing it. And Frodo, or Sam's cheering up Frodo and saying, like, what would it be like when they sing your song? And then he goes, they wouldn't be able to tell it without you. Right. Like that moment. Or they find water for the first time. And then what does drinking the water do? It reminds them that the context of their journey that they have to go through for the flourishing of life is actually connected to this whole world of life. And don't let your vision, even in times of real death and despair where you don't know, escape the joy of what happens when water hits and you go, this is the taste of what the world's to be. And then they eat lambus, and that's all they have left. But when you're fasting and the only thing you have lambus is elven bread, all of a sudden, when the only thing you have to eat is the vessel that preserves hope, then it starts to taste again like the meal you had last with your friends. And so so much of the saying yes in their journey are friends who've decided to say yes, not knowing to what doom they go. Yes. But they do it on behalf of.
Yes.
And they do it with. And I think a lot of people that may even want to say yes, it's finding the right Sam and finding the right, Lambus. What is it that nourishes you? And discovering the water and memory, because some of the biggest reasons we say no, and some of the biggest reasons even we never say no, we just get burnt out, disengaged, and don't practice, is because historically we're very much right, like walking through Mordor. And I think the relational reframing that you do in part 2 really, really resonates with me. And since if this is the early church and something from this is later canonized, I'm really hoping that, in 2000 years, Tolkien is in the end of the early church fathers and mothers. So
I like that. I like that. And, it's so interesting. I remember the first time I read Lord of the Rings, that long section of the drudgery and this sort of almost dread and doom as you're heading to Mount Doom, this sense that, but we're going to put our foot in front of the other because it's the right thing to do. This is what we have to do. There's a job here for us to do. I'll never forget that. It's as soon as you bring it up, it rings true with me still. Maybe a good way to close this section is to say it this way, that I have friends who are not Christians who would have said to me, please keep at it, because the Christian religion is big enough and powerful enough to destroy the world. If the Christian religion doesn't get its act together, it's not just human beings, it's the ecosystems that fail. And they, would plead with me, don't give up, please keep it up. What you're doing is important for the rest of us. And the irony of this is I don't, that logic is not, you get to be part of the world's superior religion. It's not it at all. It's, you get to be part of suffering on behalf of the world. The irony is, well, I think it's obvious there what that does to me.
One of the things that happens or could happen in conversations people have about sharing yes is that many Christians have learned to internalize and form their lips to the yeses that are recognized in congregations, depending on what that is, and sound it out. But one of the gifts, conversations with friends around a text like this, or wrestling just with the question of why I say yes, is that you actually learn what deeply animates and motivates your friends and neighbors' faith. And though we've known each other a long time, like reading your yeses and what you picked versus the others, like reveals to me something about my friend Brian McLaren. Do you have any suggestions for what is it like to, in a sense, host and hold space for people to be honest about what is the animating part, and what it's like to share them? Because when you critique someone's yes answer, that's real different than critiquing, the proof for this or an explanation for this.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this, a story comes to mind when you say that question. And the relevance of this story is that each of us is at a different place. And I have no desire to attack or criticize somebody for being where they are, But years ago, when I was a pastor, a pastor of a different denomination in my area came to our little pastors gathering one day, and his wife had been in a long descent with cancer. And he sat down at our lunch, and he looked terrible. He'd been looking worse each month as his wife's condition deteriorated. She was very near the end. And he said, and that day, none of the women ministers happened to be there. So he said, brothers, I need to tell you, I've lost my faith. Watching my wife suffer, I have no faith in God left. He said, I'm losing my wife. I've lost my faith. I can't afford to lose my job. So he said, I have to keep going through the motions, but I have to be honest to somebody to tell them where I am. And I'll never forget that day, his honesty. And I also will never forget that all of us just poured out our love to him. Nobody tried to fix him. It was one of those moments where human compassion worked, as it should. And our friendships and support for him continued. And he ended up a few years later, I think, having his faith come back in a new way, But the ability to be honest about where he was extremely important. And it's one of the other things I hope can happen, not just through this book, but through the conversations that people are going to have, that people will feel we all need places to be 100% as honest as we possibly can be, the good, the bad, and the ugly, about why we're leaving, why we're staying, and anything in between.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Brian.